I never knew that one wrong turn in a blizzard could change absolutely everything. The overnight Greyhound from Detroit smelled of damp wool and stale coffee, though I only knew that from memory, not actual experience. My nose had stopped registering the scent of the world a long time ago. I stepped off the bus at Union Station, Chicago, at 5 in the morning. The wind coming off Lake Michigan hit me like a physical blow, carrying the kind of biting cold that settled into your bones and refused to leave. In my worn backpack, I carried 2 changes of clothes, a crumpled city map, and the desperate hope that Victor Thorne would never find me here. Victor was an alpha who viewed omegas not as partners, but as acquisitions to be controlled and displayed. When my father traded me to settle a gambling debt, Victor had smiled at me, a smile that promised a gilded cage with very sharp bars. I ran the night before the bonding ceremony. I traded the suffocating fear of Detroit for the freezing, vast anonymity of Chicago. I stood on the pavement, the snow swirling around the street lamps like crushed glass, and told myself this was a beginning, not a defeat, a beginning. Then, I looked at my map, looked at the towering silhouettes of the skyscrapers looming in the dark, and realized I was hopelessly lost. My phone was dead. The street signs were obscured by the driving snow. I pulled my thin coat tighter around my shoulders, shivering violently, scanning the desolate street for anyone who looked approachable. At the corner, partially obscured by the shadow of a grand awning, stood a man. He didn't look approachable. He looked like the architecture of the city itself, cold, unyielding, and expensive. He wore a black cashmere coat that seemed to absorb the dim morning light. His dark hair dusted lightly with snow. But what caught my attention wasn't his clothes. It was the absolute, contained stillness about him. The snow seemed to fall around him rather than on him. He was looking down at his phone, his jawline sharp, his expression a mask of bored, untouchable authority. Most omegas, I have been told, have a biological alarm system, a visceral, chemical reaction to dominant alpha pheromones that screams lower your eyes, submit, or run. I did not have that alarm. Without a functioning olfactory nerve, the invisible hierarchies of the world simply bypassed me. I didn't register the heavy, crushing aura of dominance that this man was undoubtedly projecting into the icy air. I just saw a local who wasn't currently moving. So, I walked up to him. "Excuse me," I said, my teeth chattering slightly. "I'm trying to find the blue line towards Wicker Park, and I think I've managed to walk in the exact wrong direction." The man went entirely still. The air around him seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He slowly lifted his head, and I met his eyes. They were dark in a way that had no name beyond dark, and fixed on me with an intensity that felt almost violent. He looked at me as if I were a hallucination, an anomaly that defied the laws of physics. I would learn later that Julian Vance, the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld, had instinctively flooded the street with a pheromone warning so thick, so laced with territorial aggression, that any ordinary Omega would have dropped to their knees in sheer panic. I, however, just sneezed. The cold air was irritating my sinuses. "Sorry," I sniffled, wiping my nose with the back of my glove. "The snow is brutal today. Do you know where the station is?" Julian stared at me. For 3 agonizing seconds, he didn't blink. He looked at my face, my relaxed posture, my eyes that met his without a single ounce of submission or fear. Something flickered across his expression, a micro-movement of his brow, a fracture in the ice. It was the look of a man encountering something he had never seen in his entire life, and suddenly realizing he needed to understand it. 2 blocks north, his voice was a low, resonant baritone that thrummed in the quiet air. "Take a left at the light. The entrance is underground." 2 blocks north, left at the light, I repeated, committing it to memory. I offered him a bright, shivering smile, the kind you give any helpful stranger who does an ordinary kindness. "Thank you so much. Have a good morning." I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I had places to be and a life to build. I didn't see him standing there in the snow, ignoring his waiting car, watching my retreating figure until I disappeared around the corner. By 8 o'clock, the sun was a pale smear behind the clouds, and I found myself standing in front of a storefront in the artsy, brick-lined streets of Wicker Park, the glass red bloom and thorn in faded gold lettering. Through the window, it was a jungle of color ferns, orchids, and buckets of winter roses. I pushed the door open. A small brass bell chimed. The warmth of the shop enveloped me. I couldn't smell the damp earth or the crushed greenery, but I could feel the heavy, comforting humidity of it on my frozen skin. A woman with sharp eyes and silver-streaked hair looked up from a counter where she was trimming stems. "Eleanor." "I need a job," I said, my voice finally steady. "I don't have references, and I can't smell the flowers. But I have a good eye for color, and I work hard." Eleanor studied me for a long moment, taking in my wet boots, my worn backpack, and the desperate, stubborn set of my jaw. She didn't ask questions she knew I wouldn't answer. "Put an apron on," she said simply, gesturing to a canvas hook on the wall. "Let's see what you can do." I stood in the center of the shop, surrounded by silent, vibrant life, and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since Detroit. I was safe. No one knew me here. Victor Thorne was a ghost of the past, and my future was a blank, quiet canvas. Or so I thought. I didn't know yet that you don't just walk up to Julian Vance, smile at him like he is ordinary, and walk away without consequence. 3 weeks in Chicago taught me that peace is a fragile, quiet thing. You don't announce it, you just hold your breath and hope it stays. My life had shrunk to the warm, humid interior of Bloom and Thorne and the small, drafty apartment I rented 2 blocks away. I spent my days stripping thorns from roses, changing out murky water, and building structural masterpieces out of ferns and lilies. Because I couldn't smell the overwhelming blend of floral scents, my mind focused entirely on texture, geometry, and color. Elena realized quickly that while I was useless at identifying a flower in the dark, I had an uncanny instinct for visual drama. I was happy. I was invisible. That illusion of invisibility cracked on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. The bell above the door jingled, accompanied by a blast of icy wind. The man who walked in did not belong in a flower shop. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a leather jacket that strained across his broad shoulders, and a thick gold chain rested against his collarbone. He carried himself with the heavy, arrogant role of a man used to taking up space and expecting others to shrink. I didn't shrink. I just saw a customer tracking dirty slush onto Elena's newly mopped floor. "Can I help you?" I asked, wiping my pruning shears on my apron. The man paused, looking at me with a profound, almost aggressive confusion. I imagine he was radiating enough dominant alpha pheromones to make the orchids wilt, likely a deliberate tactic to intimidate whoever was behind the counter. For me, the air just felt a bit drafty. "I need a centerpiece," he grunted, his voice like gravel grinding together. "For a meeting. My boss is hosting someone, important arrival. Needs to look expensive. Needs to look like we don't give a damn, but we're still in charge. A power play centerpiece," I summarized cheerfully. "I can work with that. Do you have a color palette in mind?" He stared at me as if I had just spoken to him in ancient Latin. "Just make it big." "Right. Leave it to me." I turned to the cold buckets in the back. The gray Chicago afternoon was depressing enough, so I decided to go with something high contrast. I pulled out a dozen vibrant, unapologetic yellow hyacinths. They were bold and structural. To balance the brightness, I reached for a bucket of deep, velvet purple monkshood that had arrived that morning. The tall, hooded petals of the monkshood contrasted beautifully against the cheerful yellow. I arranged them in a heavy, black ceramic vase, creating a striking, jagged silhouette that looked modern and fiercely elegant. "Here you go." I set the heavy vase on the counter. Purple and yellow are complementary on the color wheel. It's a very confident choice. The brick house of a man looked at the flowers, then at my completely untroubled face. He paid in cash, grabbed the vase with one massive hand, and walked out, looking deeply unsettled by the entire transaction. I thought nothing of it. I simply wiped the counter and went back to work. I would only learn weeks later what that specific bouquet did to the delicate geopolitical balance of the Chicago underworld. According to what Declan Julian's notoriously stoic second-in-command told me later over a cup of coffee, that Tuesday afternoon was pure chaos at the Vance estate. The customer, it turned out, was a lieutenant for the South Side Syndicate, a group currently locked in a tense territorial dispute with Julian's organization. They had brought the flowers to a sit-down meeting at a neutral restaurant. Julian had not attended, but his top capos were there. When the capos reported back to Julian's Gold Coast mansion, they brought a photograph of the centerpiece. In a wood-paneled war room, 5 of the most dangerous men in Chicago sat around a mahogany table, sweating profusely as they stared at an antique copy of the Victorian language of flowers. "It's a threat," Declan had announced, tapping the page with a grim, pale finger. "Yellow hyacinths. They symbolized jealousy, rejection, and profound sorrow. And the purple ones, that's monkshood, aconite wolfsbane. It literally means beware. A deadly foe is near." The room had fallen into a stunned, paranoid silence. The South Side gang wasn't known for subtlety. Who had orchestrated this brilliant, chilling piece of psychological warfare? Julian, who had been sitting at the head of the table in absolute silence, leaned forward to inspect the photograph. His dark eyes bypassed the symbolism entirely and locked onto the jagged, architectural style of the arrangement. He noted the high contrast, the fearless use of space, the specific, meticulous wrapping around the base. He knew that style. He had been quietly parking his car across the street from a certain shop in Wicker Park for 3 weeks just to watch the blonde boy in the window arrange flowers. Julian hadn't told his men about me. He hadn't told anyone. But looking at that photograph, he had pressed his hand over his mouth to hide what was reportedly the first genuine smile his capos had seen on his face in a decade. "Don't retaliate," Julian had ordered his bewildered men, his voice smooth and laced with a strain. Dark amusement. The South Side didn't plan this. They just walked into the wrong shop. I knew none of this at the time. All I knew was that on Wednesday evening, as I was sweeping the sidewalk in front of Bloom and Thorne under the glow of the street lamp, a sleek, black car pulled up silently to the curb. The rear window rolled down just an inch. The bitter cold air rushed between us, but I didn't need to see the man's face clearly to know the contained, immovable presence sitting in the backseat. It was the man from the blizzard. He didn't speak. He just looked at me through the narrow gap in the window, his dark eyes taking in my apron, my broom, and the fact that I was still standing my ground. I stopped sweeping. I looked back at the tinted glass, leaning slightly on my broom. "If you need directions again," I called out, my breath pluming in the freezing air, "you're going to have to actually roll the window down." The window slid down the rest of the way. Julian Vance looked at me, looking less like a phantom of the city, and more like a man who had finally found the punchline to a joke he had been waiting his whole life to hear. "I'm not lost this time," he said quietly. And something in the way he said it made my heart execute a strain, unfamiliar flutter against my ribs. He opened the heavy door of the town car and stepped out into the biting wind. The street lamp cast long, cinematic shadows across the snow-dusted pavement, highlighting the sharp angles of his face. He didn't hurry. He moved with that same deliberate, contained authority I had noticed during the blizzard, crossing the sidewalk and pushing open the glass door of Bloom and Thorn. The brass bell jingled, a cheerful, entirely inadequate announcement for a man who looked like he owned the shadows. The warm, humid air of the shop immediately enveloped him. He stood just inside the threshold, a monolithic figure in a dark cashmere coat, looking profoundly out of place among the delicate ferns and buckets of pastel peonies. Elena was in the back room, tallying the day's receipts, leaving just the two of us in the softly lit storefront. "We're technically closing," I said, my hands pausing on the broom handle. "But if you need something quick, I can help." He didn't move toward the flowers. He moved toward me, stopping exactly 3 feet away. Without my sense of smell, I couldn't register the heavy, territorial alpha pheromones he must have been projecting. The kind that usually warned omegas to lower their gaze and expose their necks. Instead, I only noticed the physical reality of him. The snowflakes melting into the dark wool of his shoulders, the faint, sharp chill of the winter air clinging to him, and those impossible, fathomless eyes. "You made the arrangement yesterday," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low rumble, smooth and dangerous. For the man in the leather jacket. I leaned the broom against the counter, suddenly understanding. "The power play centerpiece. He works for you." "Something like that," he replied, his expression unreadable. "He brought it to a meeting. Yellow hyacinths and purple monkshood." I smiled, genuinely pleased that the arrangement had been memorable. "It's a striking combination, isn't it? Very bold." He tilted his head, his gaze narrowing a fraction of an inch, analyzing me with the precision of a jeweler inspecting a potentially flawed diamond. It was specific. Hyacinths for rejection and sorrow. Monkshood for a deadly foe. It read as a highly sophisticated, calculated threat. I blinked once, twice. Then, a laugh escaped me, a sudden, bright sound that echoed strangely in the quiet shop. "A threat? Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Did I ruin his meeting?" His jaw tightened infinitesimally, but he didn't speak. He waited. "I didn't know they meant all that," I explained, waving a hand dismissively toward a bucket of lilies. "I can't smell them, you see. I had an accident when I was a kid that ruined my olfactory nerves. I don't know what half these flowers are called in those old Victorian dictionaries, let alone what they smell like. I chose them for the contrast." "The contrast?" He repeated the words slowly, as if testing them for a hidden trap. "Color theory," I said simply. "Purple and yellow are complementary colors on the wheel. They create visual tension. Your guy came in asking for something that looked expensive and aggressive. The jagged shape of the monkshood against the bright, unapologetic yellow did exactly that. It was purely aesthetic." For a long, suspended moment, the man just stared at me. He looked at my worn apron, my hand slightly stained with green sap, and the completely untroubled, honest expression on my face. And then, the extraordinary happened. The rigid, impenetrable architecture of his face softened. The tension that seemed permanently coiled in his broad shoulders released by a fraction of an inch. A sound that was half sigh, half chuckle rumbled in his chest, so quiet I almost missed it. He realized, in that humid, flower-scented room, that the brilliant, psychological mastermind terrifying his rivals was just a clueless, color-obsessed omega with a broken nose. "Color theory," he murmured, shaking his head slightly. The ghost of a smile finally materialized, reaching his eyes and transforming him into someone devastatingly human. "You have no idea what you did." "Apparently not," I said, feeling that strange flutter in my chest again. "Should I apologize to your boss?" "No," he said softly, his eyes dropping to my lips for a microsecond before returning to my gaze. "I think the boss found it highly entertaining." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sleek, black leather wallet. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and laid it on the counter. "What's this for?" I asked. "For the color theory," he said. He turned and walked back toward the door. As his hand grasped the brass handle, he paused, looking over his shoulder. "My name is Julian. Julian Vance." "I'm Ollie," I replied, the name feeling safe in my mouth for the first time in months. Julian nodded once, a gesture that felt strangely like a vow, and stepped back out into the blizzard. Outside, through the frosted glass, I saw him pause by the car, his tall, imposing second-in-command. The man I would later know as Declan stepped forward, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind. I couldn't hear the conversation through the thick glass, but years later, Julian would tell me exactly what was said. "Boss," Declan had asked, his hand hovering near the inside of his jacket. "Who was the strategist?" "There is no strategist, Declan," Julian had replied, his voice reverting to the cold, absolute authority of a king, though a faint trace of warmth still lingered in his eyes. "It was an accident." "An accident," Declan had repeated, struggling to process a world where a floral accident could dictate syndicate negotiations. "Put men on this street," Julian ordered, his gaze fixing on the softly lit window of the flower shop. "Discreet. 4 men on rotation. No one touches this block. No one touches him." Inside the shop, completely ignorant of the invisible fortress that had just been erected around me, I picked up the $100 bill. It felt crisp and heavy. I looked at the spot where Julian Vance had stood, realizing that for the first time since I fled Detroit the Heavy, suffocating dread in my chest had evaporated. I didn't know he was a criminal empire's architect. I didn't know he was dangerous. I only knew that when he looked at me, I felt an inexplicable, overwhelming sense of safety. For the next 2 weeks, Julian Vance became a quiet, constant architecture in my life. He never intruded. He simply existed at the edges of my routine. Sometimes I would see his black car parked across the street when I opened the shop in the morning. Sometimes he would walk in right before closing, buy a single, unadorned white rose, and leave it on the counter without a word. It was the most respectful, terrifyingly intense courtship I had ever experienced. I was lulled into a false sense of security. I forgot that the ghosts of Detroit had legs. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Eleanor had gone to the wholesale market, leaving me alone to process a massive shipment of eucalyptus. When the shop bell jingled, I didn't look up immediately, my hands busy stripping leaves from the thick stems. "We're just processing stock right now, but feel free to." I stopped. There were 2 men standing in the center of the shop. They didn't have the tailored, lethal grace of Julian's men. They wore off-the-rack suits that pulled too tight across the shoulders, and they carried the specific, restless energy of hounds that had finally cornered a rabbit. I recognized the one on the left, Marcus. He was Victor Thorne's head enforcer back in Detroit. My blood turned to ice water. Well, Marcus said, his voice a nasty, nasal sneer. "Look what we found playing in the dirt. Mr. Thorne has been very worried about you, little Omega." My hands tightened around the pruning shears. I kept my face blank, refusing to give them the satisfaction of my terror. "I don't know anyone by that name. You have the wrong shop." Marcus laughed. The other man, a hulking brute with a scarred jaw, stepped forward. He didn't speak instead. He simply flexed his jaw and stared at me. I knew what he was doing. I had seen alphas do it 100 times. He was releasing a concentrated, punishing wave of dominance pheromones, a chemical command designed to force an Omega's nervous system into immediate, paralyzing submission. Most Omegas would have hit their knees, suffocating under the sheer biological weight of the threat. I just stood there, holding a branch of eucalyptus. The brute blinked, looking momentarily confused. He stepped closer, glaring harder, presumably dialing up his pheromone output to maximum capacity. "Are you having a stroke?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. "Because if you are, I can call an ambulance. If not, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the Persian rug. Your boots are wet." Marcus looked from the brute to me, genuinely baffled by my lack of physiological response. "Drop the shears and get on the floor," he barked, reaching inside his jacket. "I literally just swept," I said, gripping the shears tighter. Before Marcus could pull his weapon, the brass bell above the door jingled again. It was a soft, cheerful sound, followed immediately by a drop in atmospheric pressure, so severe it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Julian stepped inside. Declan followed, quietly locking the deadbolt behind them. Julian didn't shout. He didn't pull a gun. He simply stood by the doorway, his hands in the pockets of his dark coat, looking at the 2 men from Detroit the way one looks at a cockroach on a dining table. Marcus froze. He recognized him. Anyone in the Midwest, underworld knew the face of the King of Chicago. The color drained from the enforcer's face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. "You're tracking snow onto the floor," Julian said. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it vibrated with a violence that made the glass panes rattle. "Mr. Vance," Marcus stammered, raising his hand slowly. We didn't know this was your territory. We're just here to collect a runaway for Mr. Thorne. It's domestic business." Julian's eyes shifted to me. He took in my pale face, my white-knuckled grip on the shears, and the defiant set of my jaw. Then, he looked back at Marcus. "Declan," Julian said softly. "Yes, boss." "Remove the trash from my city." If Victor Thorne wants to claim something in Chicago, tell him to come knock on my front door himself. Declan moved with terrifying speed. In less than 10 seconds, the two men were disarmed, subdued, and dragged out the back door into the alley. The shop fell dead silent. I dropped the shears. They hit the counter with a loud clatter. My knees, which had stubbornly refused to bow to alpha biology, suddenly gave out from pure, ordinary adrenaline. I sank to the floor behind the counter, pulling my knees to my chest. Julian was there in a heartbeat. He crouched beside me, the expensive fabric of his coat pooling on the damp floor. He didn't touch me right away. He just hovered his hands near my shoulders, offering a presence rather than a demand. "Are you hurt, Ollie?" "No," I managed to whisper. "I'm okay. I'm taking you home. It wasn't a suggestion." An hour later, we were sitting in my cramped, drafty apartment. Julian looked absurdly out of place, sitting on my cheap, second-hand sofa, but he didn't seem to care. I made 2 mugs of chamomile tea, my hands finally stopping their tremors, and sat in the armchair across from him. He watched me quietly. "When they tried to force you down," Julian finally said, his voice carefully neutral, "you didn't react. Declan said they were projecting enough hostility to drop a horse, but you just asked them to step off the rug." I looked down at my tea, watching the steam curl into the cold air of the apartment. "I told you. I can't smell them. You said you had an accident." Julian's gaze was heavy, searching. What kind of accident permanently destroys an olfactory nerve? I swallowed hard. The truth was ugly, a dark stain I had tried to leave behind in Detroit. But looking at Julian, this terrifying, beautiful man who had just dismantled 2 enforcers to keep me safe, I realized I wanted to give him the truth. "My father," I started, the words tasting like ash. "He was traditional. He believed omegas should be seen, not heard, and entirely submissive. When I was 9, I talked back to him during a dinner party. He decided I needed to learn my place." Julian went completely still. He locked me in the basement of our house. I continued, staring at the rim of my mug. It was the middle of January. Unfinished concrete, no heating, damp walls covered in black mold. He left me down there for 4 days. The cold, the dampness, it caused a severe sinus infection that went untreated. By the time my mother finally sneaked down to let me out, the fever had fried the nerves. I never smelled anything again. The silence in the apartment was deafening. I finally looked up. Julian's face was a mask of absolute, terrifying composure, but his eyes were black with a rage so profound, it seemed to swallow the light in the room. His hands were clenched into fists on his knees, his knuckles bone-white. "Julian," I whispered. He took a slow, deep breath, wrestling a monstrous anger back into its cage. When he looked at me, the rage melted into an aching, devastating sorrow. "All this time," Julian said, his voice raw, "I thought you weren't afraid of me because you couldn't smell what I am. I thought my darkness was just invisible to you." I set my tea down. I crossed the small space between us and knelt on the floor in front of his knees. I reached out and took his large, cold hands in mine. "Julian," I said firmly, forcing him to look at me, "I don't need a nose to know who you are. I see the men you command, the power you hold. I know you're dangerous." I paused, tracing the line of his knuckles. "I don't fear you because of how you look at me. I don't fear you because you waited at a door for a stray boy to finish sweeping. Smell has nothing to do with it. You are safe." Julian stared at me, the last of his impenetrable walls crumbling into dust. Slowly, he freed one hand from my grip and brought it to my face, his thumb gently tracing the line of my cheekbone. "I will never," he vowed, the words a low, fierce oath sworn in the quiet of my living room, "let anyone put you in the dark again." For 3 days after Julian's vow in my living room, the city of Chicago felt like an impenetrable fortress. The winter sky remained the color of bruised iron, and the wind off the lake was sharp enough to cut glass, but inside Bloom and Thorn, it was impossibly warm. I arranged flowers with a steady hand. Julian did not visit, but I felt his presence in the heavy, quiet security that blanketed Wicker Park. I thought the worst was over. I had underestimated the bruised ego of a monster. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the illusion shattered. Eleanor had been on the shop's landline in the back office for 10 minutes. Her voice, usually a calm, steady murmur, was clipped and sharp. When she finally emerged, her face was the color of old parchment. She walked past the counter, flipped the open sign to closed, and threw the heavy brass deadbolt. "Eleanor," I asked, a bundle of white tulips suspended in my hand. "It's only 3 o'clock. Go put your coat on, Ollie," she said, pulling the blinds down over the front windows. Her hands, which I had never seen tremble even when wielding the sharpest shears, were shaking. "You need to go straight to your apartment. You lock the door, and you do not open it for anyone but Julian or Declan." The phantom cold of a concrete basement suddenly brushed against the back of my neck. "What happened?" "Word just came down the wire," Eleanor said, turning to face me. "Victor Thorne didn't just send his men back with their tails between their legs. He came with them. He arrived in Chicago 2 hours ago with a dozen enforcers. He's tearing through the hotels in the loop, flashing your picture." The white tulip slipped from my fingers, scattering across the damp floor. It wasn't just a retrieval mission anymore. By stepping foot in Chicago with his own muscle, Victor Thorne had crossed a sacred, unspoken line in the underworld. He was challenging Julian Vance's absolute authority over the city. He was willing to start a mob war, all to drag me back to a gilded cage in Detroit. I have to leave. The words spilled out of my mouth automatically, driven by a visceral, blinding panic. Eleanor, if he's here, he won't stop. He'll burn this shop to the ground. He'll go after Julian. I have to leave the city. Ollie, stop. Eleanor grabbed my shoulders, her grip surprisingly strong. You aren't running anywhere. Julian is. Julian doesn't know him, I interrupted, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. Victor is a psychopath. He destroys everything that gets between him and what he thinks he owns. I am a plague, Eleanor. I brought him to your doorstep. I pulled away from her, grabbed my coat, and bolted out the back door into the freezing alley. I ran the 2 blocks to my apartment, my lungs burning with the icy air. My mind was a chaotic blur of survival instincts. I needed my worn backpack. I needed whatever cash I had stashed in the coffee tin. I could catch a train to Seattle, or a bus to Canada. If I disappeared, Victor would leave Chicago. Eleanor would be safe. Julian would be safe. I took the stairs to my second-floor apartment 2 at a time, my keys fumbling in the lock. I burst inside, heading straight for the bedroom closet. I didn't even make it past the living room. Where do you think you're going? The voice was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Julian was standing in the shadows by my window. He wasn't wearing his tailored cashmere coat. He was in a black tactical sweater, the outline of a shoulder holster clearly visible beneath it. The air around him was entirely different from the quiet, contained man who bought white roses. This was the warlord of Chicago, an apex predator whose territory had just been breached. I froze, my hands still clutching my apartment keys. Julian, you shouldn't be here. Victor Thorne is a dead man walking. Julian finished for me, his voice devoid of any human warmth. It was a statement of absolute, terrifying fact. Declan has already locked down every major artery out of the loop. The trains are watched. The airports are covered. Thorne isn't leaving this city. You don't understand, I pleaded, stepping toward him. He wants a war. If you fight him over me, blood is going to spill on your streets. Your men could die. I'm not worth a syndicate war, Julian. Let me just pack my bag. If I run, he'll follow me, and your city will be safe. Julian moved so fast I didn't even have time to blink. In a split second, he crossed the room, his large hands gripping my face, holding me in place. His dark eyes were blazing with a ferocious, unyielding intensity. Listen to me very carefully, Ollie, he commanded, his thumbs pressing firmly against my cheekbones, grounding my spiraling panic. You are not a plague. You are not a liability. You are the only thing in this godforsaken world that I actually care about. If Victor Thorne wants to burn Chicago to the ground to get to you, I will drown him in the ashes. Julian, please, a tear escaped, hot and desperate, sliding over his thumb. I can't let you get hurt because of me. He cannot hurt me, Julian said fiercely, leaning down until his forehead rested against mine. The only thing that could destroy me right now is if you walk out that door. Do you understand? I spent 14 years building this empire in the dark. I am not letting some Detroit thug drag the only light I've ever found back into a basement. I stared into his eyes, seeing the absolute, terrifying truth of his words. He wasn't acting out of pride or territorial instinct. He was acting out of love, a dark, possessive, violently protective love that refused to yield a single inch. I'm terrified, I whispered, finally admitting the core of my panic. I know, Julian murmured, his voice softening, his hand slipping down to wrap securely around my waist. But you don't have to be. Not anymore. He pulled me against his chest, burying his face in my hair. Outside, the screech of tires echoed down the avenue, followed by the heavy, coordinated slamming of car doors. The Vance syndicate was assembling. The streets of Wicker Park were being fortified. The King of Chicago was going to war, and he had anchored me right in the center of his fortress. Julian pulled away from our embrace, though his hands lingered on my waist for a second longer than necessary. The warlord of Chicago had to leave my small, drafty living room and go to war, but the man who had bought white roses seemed reluctant to break the physical connection between us. He reached for the heavy, bespoke black cashmere coat he had draped over my armchair earlier, but instead of putting it on over his tactical sweater, he stepped behind me and settled the heavy wool over my shoulders. Keep this on, Julian commanded softly, pulling the lapels snug around my chest. Declan will have men outside your door and at the bottom of the stairs, but I want you to wear this until I get back. I pulled the coat tighter around myself. I couldn't smell the heavy, intimidating cedar and rain of his alpha pheromones that supposedly clung to the fabric. My broken senses denied me that biological comfort. But as I buried my nose in the thick cashmere collar, I caught something else. Something faint, ordinary, and profoundly grounding. Tide laundry detergent. The king of the Chicago underworld, the man who was about to orchestrate the systematic destruction of a rival syndicate, smelled like synthetic fresh linen and the crisp physical warmth of a living, breathing human being. It was the most heartbreakingly domestic detail in the world. It reminded me that he wasn't just a monster in the dark. He was my monster. And he was coming back to me. Wait, I said, my voice steadying as a new resolve crystallized in my chest. If Julian was going to fight for me, I couldn't just cower in the shadows. I had to sever the chain myself. I walked over to the small dining table, where a few leftover stems from the shop sat in a glass jar. I pulled out a single, deep magenta flower with reflexed, swept-back petals. I walked back and pressed the stem into Julian's gloved hand. Give this to Victor, I told him, looking directly into those fathomless dark eyes. Julian looked down at the delicate flower, resting against the black leather of his glove. Color theory, he asked, a faint, proud smirk touching the corner of his mouth. The language of flowers, I corrected. It's a cyclamen. In the Victorian dictionary, it translates to a final, permanent goodbye. It means resignation and absolute separation. Tell him the boy he broke isn't running anymore. Tell him I'm done. Julian's hand closed gently around the stem, protecting the bloom. He looked at me with an expression of such absolute, devastating reverence that my breath hitched. I will deliver the message, he promised, and then, he was gone. I sat on my sofa, enveloped in Julian's coat, and the faint scent of Tide, and waited. The city outside my window was eerily silent, the snow continuing to fall in thick, heavy curtains. I only know what happened in the penthouse suite of the Drake Hotel, because Declan recounted it to me weeks later, his voice tinged with a rare quiet awe. Victor Thorne had been waiting in his lavish suite, surrounded by 6 of his heaviest enforcers. He was anticipating a brutal, bloody brawl. He was expecting the King of Chicago to kick the door down with guns blazing. That was Thorne's mistake. He thought like a thug. Julian Vance operated like a sovereign. Julian didn't break the door down. The hotel manager, pale and shaking, had simply handed Declan the master keycard. Julian walked into the suite flanked by only Declan and 2 others. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked into the center of the opulent room, radiating a pheromonal pressure so violently oppressive that 2 of Thorne's betas actually dropped to their knees, gasping for air. Victor Thorne stood up, his face flushed with rage and sudden, primal panic. Vance, Thorne snarled, trying to project dominance. This is a misunderstanding. I'm just here to collect my property. Julian didn't acknowledge the greeting. He walked over to the glass coffee table separating them. Slowly, deliberately, he opened his hand and dropped the single, magenta cyclamen onto the glass. It landed with a soft final tap. You are hunting a ghost in my city. Julian's voice was the sound of ice cracking over a deep lake. And the man you are looking for sent you this. Thorne stared at the flower, his bravado faltering. This is not a negotiation. Julian continued, never breaking eye contact. If you and your men are not on the 10:00 p.m. flight back to Detroit, I will freeze your offshore accounts by midnight. By dawn, I will have the Federal Port Authority seize your shipping crates in Lake Huron. By noon tomorrow, every contact you have in the Midwest will receive irrefutable proof that you are cooperating with the feds, and your own lieutenants will tear you apart. Julian leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of the glass table. You thought you were chasing a rabbit into the woods, Victor. You didn't realize you wandered into a leviathan's jaw. Do not ever speak his name again. Thorne said nothing. He looked at the King of Chicago, looked at the delicate magenta flower on the table, and understood with sudden, crushing clarity that he was entirely, hopelessly outmatched. He had lost. According to Declan, Thorne checked out of the Drake 20 minutes later. His convoy was escorted to O'Hare Airport by Vance's men, ensuring they boarded the plane back to the decaying streets of Detroit. At 11:30 p.m., the heavy thud of footsteps echoed on the stairs outside my apartment. I stood up, pulling the cashmere coat tightly around myself. The deadbolt clicked, and the door swung open. Julian stood in the doorway. The tactical sweater was dusted with snow, and the dangerous, terrifying aura of the warlord still clung to his broad shoulders. But the moment his eyes found me, standing in the middle of the living room, wearing his coat, completely unharmed, the ice melted. The King of Chicago vanished, leaving only Julian. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and exhaled a long, shuddering breath. It's over, he said quietly. It's over, he said quietly. The words hung in the still air of my living room, severing the invisible tether of dread I had dragged behind me all the way from Detroit. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for months. My knees finally weakened, the adrenaline evaporating all at once, but Julian was there. He crossed the room and caught me before I could sink to the floor, gathering me firmly into his arms. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his broad chest rising and falling with a heavy, ragged rhythm. I wrapped my arms around him, still swathed in his heavy cashmere coat. The warlord was gone, What remained was just a man, profoundly exhausted, holding onto me as if I were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. "Come here," I murmured, pulling back just enough to take his hand. "Take your boots off, sit down. I'm making you something to eat." Julian looked at me, a faint, exhausted smile touching his lips. He let me guide him to the small dining table. He sat heavily in the worn wooden chair, watching me move around the tiny kitchen. "You don't have to cook, Ollie," he said softly. "You just dismantled a rival syndicate to keep me safe," I replied, turning on the stove to heat up a pot of vegetable soup I had made the day before. "The very least I can do is give you some leftover soup." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the sound slightly undone. For the first time since I met him, the absolute, contained stillness that usually defined him was replaced by a quiet, open vulnerability. I set a steaming bowl in front of him and sat across the table. I watched him eat, feeling a strained, profound warmth blossoming in my chest. It was the feeling of a life finally clicking into its correct alignment. Julian looked up, catching my gaze. He set his spoon down. "I haven't done this," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Let someone in. Not since I was a kid. I spent 14 years building walls because caring about things in my world gets people killed. But when I saw you on that corner in the blizzard," he shook his head, staring at my hands resting on the table. I didn't know how to walk away. I reached across the table and covered his large, scarred hand with mine. "Julian," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I don't need a sense of smell to know who you are. I can't smell the danger other people sense on you, but I also don't need pheromones to feel your warmth. I measure love by the man who waits outside a flower shop just to make sure I get home safe. I measure it by the man who smells like Tide laundry detergent beneath his expensive coats." Julian's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features. "I love you," I told him, laying the truth bare in the quiet kitchen. I have been holding on to that for weeks because I was terrified of what it meant. But I'm not running anymore, from Victor, or from this. Julian went completely still. Then he stood up, pulled me up from my chair, and cupped my face in both of his hands. His dark eyes were luminous, stripped of every shadow. "I love you," he swore against my lips. "I have loved you since the moment you asked me for directions," and smiled like I was an ordinary man. He kissed me. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was a slow, concentrated devotion, a kiss that felt like an arrival. It was a promise that he had been moving toward this exact moment his entire life. And now that he was here, he intended to stay. Months passed. The brutal Chicago winter finally surrendered, melting into a bright, breathless spring. In May, we stood on a bustling street corner in the West Loop. The harsh, biting wind off Lake Michigan had turned into a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and blossoming trees, or so Alina told me. I didn't need to smell the spring to feel it. I could feel it in the warm sunlight on my face and the relaxed, easy posture of the man standing beside me. We were looking through the large glass windows of a newly opened, independent bookstore. "You did a good job with the renovations," I told Julian, leaning my shoulder against his arm. "It's better than what it used to be," he murmured. I knew the story now. This plot of land used to be a rusted, dangerous salvage yard where Julian had spent his turbulent teenage years, working for scraps to survive after his mother died. He had bought the property years ago through a shell company, letting it sit empty. It wasn't until this spring that he finally ordered it cleared and rebuilt into a place of quiet refuge. It was his own silent way of healing an old wound. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, smiling at the caller ID. I stepped away slightly to answer. "Mom, yeah, I'm here. I'm safe," I listened to her tearful, relieved voice on the other end of the line. I had finally called her 3 weeks ago, once Julian's men had ensured Victor Thorne's empire in Detroit was thoroughly dismantled by the feds. She was crying again, but this time, they were tears of joy, I know. "I'll come visit soon, I promise. I love you too." I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked over at Julian. He was watching me, his hands in his pockets, the morning sun catching the dark strands of his hair. He looked completely at peace. I walked back to him, slipping my hand into his. He interlaced our fingers, immediately a reflexive, anchoring gesture. I never knew that one wrong turn in a blizzard could change absolutely everything. I had arrived in Chicago as a ghost, a boy running blindly from a monster, entirely devoid of a compass. But standing there in the spring sunlight, holding the hand of the king of Chicago, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been running away from my life. I had been running toward it. I just hadn't known it until I asked a stranger for directions.